We started out wanting this to be a companion to our GPU benchmark for Destiny 2, hoping that we'd have a full suite of CPU benchmarks to definitively and confidently state which CPUs are better in the current beta state of Destiny 2. What it turned into was more of a research piece. We looked into performance across different settings. We attempted to optimize those settings on the CPU side and looked into multiplayer versus campaign performance. A lot of the stuff we did with the GPU benchmark, except applied to CPUs as well. And there's a good reason for that, which we'll talk about through this video. Before that, we partnered with LastPass to bring you this video. LastPass is a password manager that helps generate random passwords for each account, ensuring unique passwords for every login. LastPass strengthens account security so that you're no longer using the same password for multiple sites. Learn more at the link below. So let's go through a quick recap of the GPU benchmark. First of all, in the GPU testing, we found a few important things. One of them is that depth of field destroys performance, particularly frame times with AMD hardware when it's at its highest settings, as in using the highest preset. So specifically to address that, what we would suggest is that if you're looking at playing this game, consider using, if you can support the highest preset, and then go manually drop down depth of field to something lower. Ambient occlusion also had somewhat of an impact. All of that's in the GPU benchmark. Won't rehash it all here. But if you want to learn more about the GPU side of things, check that content. It's also got all of the research that went into the initial part of this one. Now, because this is a beta that has a limited time before it expires, we were basically researching stuff, encountering issues, trying to figure them out while we were going, which means there's no room to really adjust the core benchmarks on the fly. So what we have for you is a more detailed look at how the CPUs perform under different parameters within the game. And we do have comparative benchmarks between CPUs, but they're not the core focus of this content because thanks to a few decisions that the Destiny team has made, our confidence in some of the numbers are a bit lower than we'd like, one of which is a limitation on SMT. AMD's SMT is effectively, well, not even effectively, it's just plain unutilized in Destiny 2 right now from what we've seen. And we can ultimately only speak to what we've seen. So there's room for things to be different. It is a beta, keep that in mind. Stuff can change. Drivers are game ready for the NVIDIA card that we use for the CPU benchmarks. They should be fine, but can still change. So there's room for differences in other benchmarks and what other people do and test and things like that. But we did not see any functional gain from SMT being enabled, which means that a lot of the Ryzen CPUs just lose that advantage that they have on the thread side. So some decisions here that we didn't like. Fraps being broken is another one. So not just Fraps, but on-screen displays. Fraps, I believe Afterburner and Riva Tuner and a couple of other solutions broke today, the day of filming this, and they worked the previous day during the private beta. So basically Bungie went in there and disabled them from what we understand. And it sounds like that's for some kind of anti-cheat or anti-hack purpose. Hopefully by the time the game ships, they have a better solution than just breaking everything that people use for every other game in the PC world, especially since Bungie is trying to come out of this swinging saying, hey, PC players, look at what we're doing for you, relatively uncapped frame rate, etc. Also, don't use any software or else. So I'd like to see that change. But we'll see if it does with the October launch. Either way, all of our tools worked the first day of the beta, and then we had to switch to other tools for the second day that still worked, but those might get phased out as well once Bungie discovers them. So let's get into this. Starting with the CPU side of things, it's all CPU side, I suppose, today. What we're looking at is the thread limitations, and then going into multiplayer and campaign differences. So straight away, we noticed that thread utilization was a mixed bag. Destiny punishes Ryzen CPUs by ignoring SMT. We didn't have time to test it, but if you disabled SMT, you might get an uplift like we saw in other games at launch of Ryzen. And so this was ignored to the point of seeing a 0% utilization, more or less, on the SMT threads. The Ryzen 7 1700, with all physical cores engaged, did not report any of its additional threads engaged. So you're looking at 8 cores utilization and 8 untouched. This remained a theme for the 1600X as well, where the logical threads did not engage with the game. The good news is that we've seen this before. Total War, Warhammer, and Battlefield 1 both pushed updates post-Ryzen that improved performance on Intel and AMD alike. This was primarily by better utilizing the SMT threads, and again, it benefited both companies. So we're unclear on if this will happen for Destiny 2 at some point, but for now, we're off to a rough start, and that's more on Bungie's end than anything. So hopefully AMD can work with Bungie to try and fix this going forward. But for now, the game is reasonably optimized on GPUs to the point where it actually performs decently once you eliminate depth of field issues, and it's lacking heavily on the CPU front. So kind of disappointed to see that. Let's look at performance scaling in competitive multiplayer versus the intro campaign, effectively single player. As a reminder, this was tested for our GPU benchmark as well, and we found that scaling was highly consistent on our 7700K, 1080 Ti, 1050 Ti, and RX 580. We'll cycle through some of those tests on the screen now, but the full recap is in the bench video for the GPUs. Ultimately, standard deviation was far greater in multiplayer, and the average performance tended to be within a couple percentage points of campaign, generally about a 6% difference performance between multiplayer and the campaign, but with far greater consistency and tighter standard deviation in the campaign tests, which ultimately made it more desirable. As you can see with the 7700K numbers, most of the campaign tests were within bounds of the more variable competitive testing on Midtown. This makes campaign a good stand-in that's representative of multiplayer during our GPU benchmarks, but again, more on that in the GPU video. So let's look at the table of our 1200 runs on the Midtown multiplayer map using 1080p highest settings across multiple competitive matches. We're averaging 85 FPS with lows at 59 for 1% and 40 for 0.1%. The range is 79 FPS to 90 FPS for this test sequence, with standard deviation at about 5 FPS for the averages. Bringing the campaign results on the screen now to share space, the R3 1200, still at 1080p highest, is showing standard deviation tightened to 0.8 FPS average. The final bench score is 94 FPS average, 60 FPS 1% lows, and 52 0.1% lows. This makes the campaign bench scene score approximately 9 FPS higher in averages and markedly higher in 0.1% low frame time consistency. We've got a bigger spread here than with GPU testing, unfortunately, and it seems to deal with how the lower end CPUs are engaged during multiplayer. The gap is about 9% between campaign and multiplayer with an R3, and that gives us a starting point for understanding performance throughout the game. Moving to 1080p high, our competitive matches now range from 82 to 95 FPS, averaging out to 87 FPS average, 55 FPS 1% lows, and 40 FPS 0.1% lows. Compared to the previous multiplayer logs with 1080p and highest settings, we've now got a delta of plus or minus 2 FPS average, which is effectively equal. This is a trend we run into with the low-end CPUs in comparative testing, as parts bump into a wall that isn't remedied by going from highest to high. Bringing the campaign table up, we see the final bench scene score of 93 FPS average, 1% lows, 61, 0.1% lows at 52. Compared to multiplayer's final bench averages, we're about 6 FPS higher in average frame rate and 13 FPS higher in 0.1% low frame time converted FPS values. Although we saw a much smaller difference on the 7700K, so the lower end R3 CPU is more susceptible to frame time variance in multiplayer than in the campaign, at least as far as our testing goes today. Here's a frame time plot showing the R3 1200 performance at 1080p high when in a multiplayer match, matched against the same CPU and settings in campaign mode. Frame time variance is reflected visibly. If we make another frame time plot for the 7700K in campaign versus multiplayer using the settings detailed on the chart header, it's clear that the performance impact is less significant. There's a lot more to know, but we won't have enough time prior to the beta's end to figure it all out. Most of that will wait until October. Anyway, for now we're seeing bigger swings in performance on the R3 versus the i7 CPU. We'll have to reevaluate testing options for CPUs in Destiny 2 once the game properly launches, but right now the variance is greater than what we see with GPU testing, which makes test courses and planning more difficult to figure out. The best we can do for now is demonstrate those differences, help viewers understand where the game's performance may change depending on which part of the game you're playing, and then commit to some type of testing that's consistent. So we had already committed to testing for the campaign for this one because we started that with the GPUs, found it was extremely reliable and very comparable in terms of performance with the multiplayer gameplay, and so we stuck with that. Just keep in mind going through this that the lower end hardware, like the R3s, the G4560, things like that, will experience bigger frame time variance in multiplayer than what we're going to be showing with the campaign results once we get to the competitive or comparative data. So there will be a dip there if you go into multiplayer. It's still relatively comparable. We're within 9-ish% average frame rates. So we're in the ballpark. For now, this is the best we can do. Once the game ships, we'll reevaluate, invest more time into figuring out how we can do things better to fit with Bungie and Destiny 2's very strange at times requirements for the game in terms of how it behaves with different hardware. So we'll look at that then, but there's clearly only a few days right now. So this is what we've got. It's pretty good. It's not the best, but the point is you have all this data to look at the multiplayer, the campaign performance, and the performance of different graphics settings that we're going to get into. So normally this isn't stuff that's really shared as part of a benchmark. Benchmarks tend to be CPU A versus CPU B, which one's better? What we're trying to do is say, here are all of the parameters and situations that you need to look into because the game obviously has a bunch of different game modes, and then consider all of those things once we go into the core benchmarks that are going to be representative primarily of campaign play. Our next topic is the impact of graphics settings, specifically on the R3-1200, hopefully enabling us to better understand performance differences and where there's headroom for improvement. Our first attempt at improving frame rate went something like what's on the screen now. There's almost no change. In the campaign areas we tested, these settings had minimal impact. Most of the impact seems to go to either the GPU or just isn't visible at all in current accessible areas of the game, so there's room for this to change later once more zones are released. Either way, going from highest settings to lowest settings produced no measurable difference in performance and a huge difference in visual quality. We next attempted this in multiplayer, despite greater variance test to test, and found that the highest settings in multiplayer matches produced the numbers on the left, and that the minimum settings produced the output on the right of the screen. We're showing each test pass rather than just a chart with them averaged because there's more variance in each execution, so we'd like for viewers to understand what the variance looks like when you're testing multiplayer rather than just averaging them all together and muddying the waters. Our difference ended up being 85 FPS average and 40 FPS 0.1% lows for highest, with minimum settings being 95 FPS average and about 40 FPS 0.1% lows. Again, that's minimum. That's disabling stuff down below even the lowest preset just to try and figure out what kind of changes we'd see on the CPU side. The game looks awful at this point comparatively, and we can show some of that in B-roll, but all of these changes net only about a 9 to 10% performance uplift. Now, of course, this is just one CPU. If you count the 7700K from our GPU test, that's kind of two CPUs, so we can't definitively speak for all the CPUs, but as far as these go, there's more room for GPU scaling than CPU scaling in our testing for Destiny 2 beta. So all that in mind, let's get into the comparative benchmarks. Again, big reminder that this stuff is subject to change. The game is beta. The performance is sort of inadequate in some ways in terms of thread utilization and tapping into the CPU. So there's a lot that can change here. Don't read too far into it for now, but this will give you a baseline for where the beta sits. Starting comparatively with 1080p and highest settings, the Intel i7 7700K chart tops at 171 FPS average, which is bumping against the 200 FPS frame cap that's enabled by default. This means that frame time latencies faster than 5 milliseconds will be capped to 5 milliseconds, and so will drag down the average below what could be possible. The next CPU in line is the i5 7600K stock CPU, performing at 157 FPS average, 104 1% lows, and 87 0.1% lows. This is trailed by the i3 7350K at 131 FPS average, with lows at 88 1% and 79 0.1%. Our overclocked R7 1700, effectively a stand-in for the 1700X and 1800X as well, since they can all achieve similar clocks, performs at 126 FPS average at 3.9 GHz. This plants the 3.9 GHz R7 CPU a few FPS behind the i3, and part of this performance deficit is due to Destiny 2's failure to acknowledge all the threads. So we've only got physical cores engaging properly, and that's obviously a huge part of Ryzen's argument, is having all of those threads. We know that this isn't the performance people want to see out of an R7, but remember that Destiny 2 is 1, in beta, and 2, having trouble with SMT. So issues arise. We may see a performance gain later on, just like we did with Total War, but it's hard to say right now. So for now, this is what we're seeing in our testing, but because of Destiny 2's present state, our confidence isn't strong enough right now to claim with authority that these results are representative of all configurations and scenarios, as the game is still developing and clearly has issues. Down the line, the R5 1600X performs about 2.7% behind the overclocked R7 1700. Keep in mind that, as far as Bungie is concerned, The 1600X is a 6-thread CPU, and the 1700 is an 8-thread CPU. So the actual advantages of the 1700 are not reflected here beyond an additional 2 threads as far as the game is concerned. We're looking at a 200 MHz clock difference that manifests in a 2.7% boost over the other CPU. Both the 1600X and stock 1700 boost to 3.7, making them effectively equal and planting the two within variance of one another. Intel's G4560, meanwhile, performs at 110 FPS average with lows at 73 and 65. Frame times so far are reasonable across the board for all CPUs. The next closest Intel part is the 7350K, presently $70 more than the 4560 in the US, and it's about 19% faster than the 4560 in the present state of the game with our benchmarks. The R5 1400 and R3 1200 round out the low end of the pack, both near 94 FPS average. Here's where it gets interesting. Switching to 1080p with high settings, you likely barely noticed that the charts changed. A lot of the numbers remain the same or similar, with minimal scaling when reducing to high settings. Many of the options that change between high and highest are GPU limiting, like depth of field and ambient occlusion, and so won't appear in CPU-constrained tests. We've got FXAA enabled, so that's out as a variable, but if you had MSAA, you'd also see a huge GPU side hit. The performance stack is largely the same here. We've gained a few FPS for the R7 and R5, but otherwise the results are effectively within test-to-test variance. We'd have to manually adjust CPU limiting settings to get a better idea here, like items governing geometry, LOD, and view distance, but as we already saw, it doesn't seem to do a lot. We also added 1440p to testing to get an idea for how or if the CPU deltas close as more load is placed elsewhere in the system. The answer is yes. With highest settings, the i7 7700K falls to 109 FPS average from its 170 perch previously, with 1% lows at 88 and 0.1% at 79. The 7600K i5 is now just behind the 7700K, indicating a GPU bottleneck at this resolution. This is why higher resolutions and graphics settings serve as an equalizer for CPU performance in many instances. Even the i3 is nearby in averages, though technically lower in frame times. Behind the i3 is the 1600X, now getting closer to the chart-topping CPUs in performance, and this is thanks to resource limitations elsewhere, almost assuredly the GPU. We're at a deficit of 6.9% to the 7700K now, rather than the bigger gaps earlier. The 1700 at 3.9 GHz performs effectively identically within variance, and the 1700 is nearby. It's not until we hit the R5 1400 and R3 1200 that frame rate drops reasonably below the 100 FPS range. And finally, switching over to the 1440p high settings, we see general uplift for parts across the board with FPS approaching original values. There are no big changes here when compared to the 1080p high values. And if you look between them, the charts, all the numbers are plus or minus a couple FPS of each other. So some might be lower, some might be higher, but at the end of the day, they're within variance. That's it for this one. The biggest thing here to take away is the front half of the video or the article where we talk about all of the exploration of the game's options, the different parts of the game, the performance anomalies, things like that. The comparative data is interesting and hopefully puts some information out there, but keep in mind that 1, Destiny 2 is in beta, 2, we'll see how it changes on the other maps, game zones, and modes that are not released yet or not fully released yet. So there's a lot of room for changes here. The takeaway being, what I'm really trying to instill into people's minds is, rather than taking charts, copying and pasting them places, when you see people do this, because they will, rather than copying and pasting charts places and saying X CPU is better than Y CPU, just remind those people that there's some variance here. We're not fully confident in the comparative results right now because of Bungie and Destiny 2's kind of weird interactions with, well, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of stuff we didn't go over, but switching between the high, highest, low settings, things like that, there's so little impact on the CPU that you really start to question what's going on. So there might be more room in there for the CPUs to improve. We'll just have to find out. And part of that will be waiting for the game to launch officially. Part of it will be having enough time to dig through every part of the game, graphics settings, things like that. That's not something we can do alone, so we'll look for other reviewers and users who are able to explore the game and report their experiences. So please contribute to that discussion. If you get the game once it comes out, let us know what your experience is in different areas of the game so we can try and look into it. Thank you for watching. You can help us out directly by going to patreon.com/gamersnexus. And then, of course, shirts like this one are at gamersnexus.squarespace.com. This one technically is an older model, though. you've got better ones on that store than I have here. So thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.